Mapping the Imagination is about the question of the role of the imagination in seeing artworks, and specifically the power or capacity to integrate raw sensory data into a form or a gestalt, into some kind of whole.
Why do we recognize, say, a face in a piece of art rather than simply seeing the series of lines and shapes from which it's made? Professor Judith Wolf is digging into the question of how we perceive multiple artistic elements as a complete whole, and looking for those same connecting threads in the world beyond art.
We have a term that derives from German, Gestalt, and we use that term Gestalt to mean the integrated form or whole that we perceive in the raw sense data that we encounter. So whenever raw sense data integrates into a form, the form of a book or a trolley or a glass, that's the gestalt that we see. And that's part and parcel of what it means to see art. We don't only passively encounter, we actively construct what we see. And that's what we're studying in the grant, how our imagination works in these art contexts. I think something similar actually goes on in poetry, where we are often confronted with metaphors which work in a similar way. We see, love is a rose. In a sense, that's two things side by side, which don't make sense immediately, but they invite you to develop this sort of three-dimensional vision of seeing love and a rose stereoscopically, to see something new in that juxtaposition. So a sort of depth perception, which again depends on our imagination, to see something new that's not immediately there on the page. So we had congruent pairs and images that are often found together in a practical context. And we had incongruent pairs where people could find a metaphorical or symbolic connection, but not a practical connection in everyday life. And we told one group of people that these were everyday objects, and we told the other group of people that these were pairs of objects that had been exhibited in an exhibition called The Art of the Everyday. The people who thought that these were everyday objects said these two images have nothing to do with each other. And the people who thought that these were artistic said, yes, of course, there is this metaphorical connection. And that shows you that in an artistic context, people are much readier to see a sort of depth meaning and are also readier to make two incongruent objects into a single gestalt, into a single sort of composite whole. It might be that there are also contexts outside of art where some dynamic like that becomes relevant. It might play into the way that religious people or people of faith see the world as a whole. I think it certainly plays into the way that we see other people. One of the most interesting things about this grant is that we have philosophers, theologians, and psychologists working side by side. We both work on similar problems, on problems to do with perception and art, and how we learn from art. But we come with very different vocabularies. For example, the central term that I use, imagination, by which I mean the capacity to integrate raw sense data into a gestalt or form. They have a variety of forms. It can be top-down perception, it can be predictive processing. We're trying to help each other to see where each of our disciplines might have made discoveries which aren't yet expressible within the terminology or the research tool of the other discipline, but which might nevertheless be genuine insights which might lead to progress in that other discipline. This grant asks about the conditions for learning anything from art. It's not only about the kind of knowledge that we might derive from an artwork, it's about our own cognitive faculties that are involved in understanding an artwork at all. And then also the question, what that means for our everyday engagement with the world. What can we do to change how we see the world as a consequence of having encountered art?